Good afternoon. Welcome to the Analyst. Today we'll be taking up 5 newspaper articles from the Hindu and the Indian Express and discussing them. The handout for the same will be available in the description of this video for your kind perusal. Please have a look at that. The first article is related to fishing sector. The second article is related to rare diseases, as the Rare Disease Day is observed on the last day of February, which is today. The third article is related to fiscal centralization, as several state governments have been agitating, which highlights some issues in the fiscal federalism. The fourth article is related to fuel cells, as Prime Minister Modi flagged off India's first indigenously built fuel cell ferry boat. The final article is related to WTO Investment Deal, as India blocked an attempt by some WTO members to get the investment facilitation for development pact as a part of the development agenda of the 13th Ministerial Conference of WTO. Now, the first article is related to the fishing sector. The context behind it is that the fishermen of Tamil Nadu want to resume fishing near the Kachativu islet. This islet belongs to Sri Lanka. So rather, we will be discussing about the fishing sector in India as a whole, the issues plaguing the sector, as well as some government steps related to it. This is important in GS3 under the topic agriculture and some allied activities. Fisheries is an activity associated with the harvesting of fish, usually in a specific area, confined to a specific area. First, let's look at the significance of fisheries sector with respect to India. First, let's look at some data. Fisheries sector contributes to economic growth in terms of GDP contribution in India, that it contributes to 1.1% of GVA in India, that is gross value added. In terms of its contribution as a part of agriculture, it contributes to about 6% of the agricultural GVA. And in India, it is significant because India has 2.36 million hectares of ponds and tanks. India has a long coastline of 7,500 kilometers, so the fishing potential is huge. And we have 1.1 million hectares of brackish water also. It provides jobs. It provides livelihoods to 28 million people directly and indirectly in India. And if you look at the status of India globally, India is the second largest player in the aquaculture industry. And if you look at the fisheries in particular, India is the third largest producer in the fisheries sector, and we are the fourth largest exporter also. If you look at the growths in these sectors particularly, the growth rates, for example, in prawns, the compounded annual growth rate is about 10%. In fishes, there is a steady growth of about 8% annually. So it contributes significantly to the growth rates. If you look at the export items from India, the most exported items are frozen shrimps, and then it is the frozen fish, and then frozen squids and other items, etc. This is the broad picture of the fisheries sector in India and its contribution to economic growth. Now let's discuss the challenges, the issues plaguing the sector. One, there are the issues related to overfishing or unsustainable fishing in India. Overfishing means that the fish are being caught at a rate faster than they can reproduce. Usually the fish stock also needs time for reproduction, for the replenishment of the stock. If we keep on fishing in a specific area for a long time, then usually the larger fish stock will get depleted. And then the fishermen will move on to the smaller fishes, catching of other fishes like sardines or even catching of squids, etc. As per FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, in 1974 there was about 10% of the fish stocks globally which was overfished. Whereas if we compare it to now, almost more than one third of the fish stocks now are overfished around the world. And one of the major factors is also the subsidies which are provided by the governments, which also leads to overfishing at times. So the fishing has to be sustainable, allowing the larger fish also time to replenish, time to reproduce. Then there is the issue of bycatch, that the fishermen, they usually use large trawlers, bottom trawlers or gill nets, etc. Then because the fish nets are so huge, sometimes the unwanted species also come in the catch. For example, catching of turtles, etc., which the fishermen actually do not want to catch. It leads to further the loss of various marine organisms which also die as part of fishing. Then there is illegal fishing also. For example, when there is the depletion of certain fish species, their demand rises, and then there is fishing in the off season, fishing in those areas also where it is not permitted, where it is illegal. There is lack of extension services also. If information support is provided to the fishermen, it will lead to better harvesting of the fish stocks. It won't lead to any illegal fishing or unregulated fishing, etc. And also credit should also be given. The formal credit mechanism should also be put in place for the fishermen. When we look at the challenges related to infrastructure in the fisheries sector, there are also challenges. For example, the availability of quality seeds, it's not up to the mark, which leads to poor quality production of the fishes, poor fish productivity when it comes to the inland fisheries or production of fishes through ponds, tanks, etc. There is lack of cold chain facilities, the cold storage, etc., which leads to loss of the post-harvest fishing also. There are post-harvest losses as well as the lack of price discovery mechanisms. When there are real-time price discovery mechanisms, it will lead to better incomes for the fishermen also, which will further resolve the various issues which are plaguing the sector. Now let's look at the government steps to promote the fisheries sector in India and to resolve the above mentioned challenges. One, the government came up with a holistic program, Blue Revolution 2.0. Blue Revolution 2.0 is an initiative which promotes the development of inland fisheries, marine fisheries, aquaculture, mariculture, etc. in India, and it is overseen by the National Fisheries Development Board, which provides for the coordination for an integrated development of the fisheries sector in India. Then there is the holistic scheme like an umbrella scheme, Pradhan Mantri Matsya Sampada Yojana. The aim, the goal of this scheme is to promote the production of fisheries in India, to improve the productivity of the fishes, for example, through availability of quality seeds, ensuring quality, improving exports from the fishes sector. Because when there is more exports of the marine products from India, this will lead to not only the development of the fisheries, but also earning of forex reserves and contributing of economic growth in India. It promotes the creation of jobs in the fisheries sector by putting in place more processing infrastructure. The fish processing industry is promoted and improving the incomes of the fishermen. This takes into account the promotion of inland fisheries and aquaculture in India. How? For example, it involves the setting up of cold storages, improvement in the value chains and linkages for the inland fisheries as well as aquaculture, plus it accounts for the development of the aquaculture infrastructure in India. What kind of infrastructure? For example, the fish processing plants, ranching, and the seed quality availability, etc., and the development of cold storages, which will further lead to the development of the fisheries sector. Then the government came up with the program National Genetic Improvement Facility for Shrimp Breeding. This is to ensure the diversification of prawn species, for example, that is the development of indigenous species and replacement of the invasive prawn species with the indigenous ones, and it will also lead to moving away from the dependence upon any single species also. Then there is the National Surveillance Program for Aquatic Animal Diseases. This program will ensure the early information, the early diagnosis as well as early discovery of any diseases which are plaguing the aquatic animals, the marine species, etc. Then there is Fisheries and Aquaculture Infrastructure Development Fund. It is a fund of a corpus of about 7,500 crore rupees, and this fund also provides for the subsidies for the development of the fisheries infrastructure and also incentivized loans, etc. Then Kisan credit card facility has also been extended to the fishermen. This will also ensure the development of the fishermen and the fisheries industry in particular. There are new areas which are being brought under the fisheries sector. For example, the saline and brackish waters, etc., and the reservoirs and floodplains of India, that will promote the development of inland fisheries. This will also ensure that the wastelands, etc., they are also converted into productive lands by the development of fisheries. There is the e-Gopala app. The e-Gopala app is to assist the fishermen and to remove the middlemen, and it will be directly providing information to the fishermen also regarding their development. And there is the Sagar Prikarma. Sagar Prikarma also ensures the development of the fisheries sector. Thus, these are some of the initiatives taken by the government to promote the fisheries sector in general and its development holistically. Now, the next article is related to rare diseases. The context behind it is that the Rare Disease Day is observed usually on the last day of February, which is today. This is important in the paper GS3 under the topic Science and Technology, also in GS2 under Health topic it is important. Now, what are rare diseases? There is no single comprehensive definition for rare diseases. India has a policy also, a national policy on rare diseases, but that also does not give a single definition for rare diseases. It is dependent upon various factors. For example, it can be defined based upon the severity, based upon the threat to life that it poses, or based upon the treatment options, or whether it is heritable, whether it can be genetic in origin or not. Now, there are differing definitions. For example, WHO defines rare diseases as those diseases which are affecting less than one person among 1000 people. Whereas in the European Union, rare diseases are classified as those diseases which are affecting less than one person in 2000 people. In USA, it is dependent on the number of people who are affected in that country by that disease. If it is affecting less than 2 lakh people in US, then it is classified as a rare disease in the US. In India, there are about 7,000 rare diseases, and usually 70 to 80% of them are genetic in nature, that is, they are inherited from the parents. Now, what are some of the examples of the rare diseases? They can be in the form of inherited cancers, autoimmune disorders, congenital malformations, Gaucher disease, cystic fibrosis, muscular dystrophies, etc. They are called as rare diseases. Now, what are the challenges which are posed by these rare diseases? One is the definition. There is a lack of a single comprehensive definition. Second, there are issues related to diagnosis, because there is a lack of pathophysiological data or such experience among the doctors, which leads to a misdiagnosis usually in the initial stages. Then there are challenges related to treatment. That is, sometimes there is no safe or effective treatment available at all. And if the treatment is actually available, it is cost prohibitive sometimes, that is, it is too costly, too expensive for the patient to be able to bear that expense. Also, if you look at some more data, there are more than 90% rare diseases in USA which do not have any FDA approved treatment, and currently about 5% of the world's population is affected by the rare diseases, and most of them lead to permanent disability, and usually it is considered that all pediatric cancers are rare diseases only, and 80% of them are genetic in nature. And as of now, about 7,000 rare diseases are documented and known, and about 1.4% of the newborn children are affected by one of these diseases, and many of them result in the premature deaths of the infants. Now, let's come on to the National Policy for Rare Diseases 2021, that is the steps that India has taken. The Rare Diseases Policy in India categorizes the rare diseases into three groups. The first group accounts for those diseases which are amenable to a one-time treatment. That is, they can be treated in the short term. The group 2 accounts for those which have to be treated in the long run. And the group 3 accounts for those rare diseases for which there is a treatment, effective treatment available, but there are issues related to the optimal selection of the patients. That is, usually it is so expensive that the patients have to be selected, and it provides for a financial support also. That is, the rare diseases which are classified under group 1, there 20 lakh rupees is provided as financial support from the side of the government. And for the group 3, usually government promotes the crowdfunding, that is the money which is needed for the cure, for the treatment of the group 3 diseases, that has to be funded from the crowdsourcing. Then the beneficiaries are not only the BPL people, not only the below poverty line people, but about 40% of Indian population is covered as part of the beneficiaries. That is the people who are eligible beneficiaries under the Ayushman Bharat program of the Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana. There is a registry of rare diseases which will be maintained, which will be kept. This will be based upon the national hospitals as per this policy, and the policy promotes the early screening as well as prevention. This will be done by referring the cases to the Nidan Kendras and the various centers of excellence which the policy aims to set up. And the policy aims to strengthen the tertiary healthcare facilities. These will be strengthened by again setting up 8 centers of excellence for the cure of the rare diseases in India, and they will be provided a one-time support of 5 crore rupees also from the side of the government. These are the broad points under the policy. But there are certain concerns regarding this policy also. One, the policy misses out upon giving a comprehensive definition for the rare diseases. There is no definition which is provided under it. If there is no definition, it leads to a lack of data also, and sometimes misdiagnosis also. And the group 3, which has been classified, the diseases accounting for the group 3 in the policy, they have been neglected because the funding for them will have to be crowdsourced. The government is not providing financial support, and the standard operating procedures have not been put in place. For example, there is no mechanism to refer the patients to the Nidan Kendras. The Nidan Kendras will be providing that provision for the counseling and treatment, etc. And the support of the states is needed for the implementation of the policy. But the states themselves are also dependent upon the healthcare workers only. There are no trained investigators for finding out the prevalence of the rare diseases in the state. Plus the financial support that is provided uniformly for the diseases classified under group 1 of the classification of the policy. That is a constant financial support of 20 lakh rupees. What if the treatment needs only 10 lakhs? What if it needs 30 lakhs? But the financial support is uniform, that is 20 lakhs only. It can be done maybe disease-wise financial support. Plus the empanelment, there are no guidelines that there have to be some hospitals which have to be empaneled, that the patients who are suffering from the rare diseases, they go to those hospitals and then it is reimbursed, then financial support is given by the government, but there are no guidelines for the empanelment. Plus the pharma industry also have to be incentivized, because the drugs which are needed for the cure, for the treatment of the rare diseases, they also have to be developed. They are often treated as orphan drugs, that the pharma industry is not willing to invest in the development of such drugs, because usually the demand will not be high, and for recovering that cost, it will have to charge higher cost, higher money for those drugs, which the government will come back and impose the price control orders, etc. Now, what are some suggestions to improve the situation regarding rare diseases? One, we can come up with a comprehensive definition to ensure that there is collection of data as well as there is no misdiagnosis. We can go for the awareness generation among the people so that there is early screening, early detection of the rare diseases, plus the measures for the cooperation and collaboration within India, within the states, also internationally also, to share the research data, etc., to share the treatments available is needed. There are some examples as model best practices that you can suggest while talking about the rare diseases. One is the USA Orphan Drugs Act. What USA does is it incentivizes the development of drugs which are needed for the treatment of rare diseases. How does it incentivize? It gives tax breaks, etc. It gives research grants to the researchers. It gives market exclusivity to the pharma giants for the development of the drugs needed. The European Union also has a program on rare diseases. It promotes the research again on the rare diseases, and Singapore has a rare disease fund which India can also establish on similar lines. Now, the next article is related to fiscal centralization. The context behind it is that various state governments have been agitating regarding the devolution of funds. For example, Kerala government. This highlights the issues in the practice of fiscal federalism, the devolution of funds in India. This topic is important in GS3 under Indian economy and issues related to it. Now, India has a multi-tier government structure. That is, on top there is the union government, then there is the state government, and then there are the local governments which are established under the 73rd, 74th constitutional amendment, that is Panchayati Raj institutions and urban local bodies. The total national resources, they are first divided between the center and the states, and then the central funds, they are devolved on the recommendations of the Central Finance Commission in the form of the union's share and the state's share. And then out of that there are funds which are devolved to the local bodies also, that is Panchayati Raj institutions and urban local bodies also. Likewise, from the state level resources also, there are funds which are devolved to the Panchayati Raj institutions and urban local bodies on the recommendations usually of the state finance commissions, etc. Now, let's look at the broad structure of the fiscal devolution in India. There are two kinds of transfers. One are the statutory transfers from the central government to the states. The other are the non-statutory transfers. The statutory transfers are those which are by virtue of some legal provisions or by virtue of some constitutional provisions. For example, the Finance Commission is constituted under Article 280 of the Constitution, and it recommends the devolution of the net tax revenues to the states also. That is, usually it is recommended by the Finance Commission how much money, how much of the revenues out of the net tax revenues collected by the union government have to be shared with the state governments. Then there are some grants in aid which are provided by the central government to the states under Article 275 of the Constitution. These are also recommended by the Finance Commission, but these are discretionary in nature. That is, the central government provides these to some state governments for the implementation of usually some specific schemes for some certain purpose usually. Then the non-statutory transfers are those which are usually provided for the implementation of some schemes, either central sector schemes or the centrally sponsored schemes. In the centrally sponsored schemes, some money has to be contributed by the state governments also. So this non-statutory transfer in the form of the implementation of some schemes, they are usually tied grants. That is, this money has to be utilized for the implementation of some scheme, some particular scheme only. Now, why fiscal centralization? Let's look at some evidences, some empirical data which shows that there is actually fiscal centralization happening in India. Let's look at some hard data. One, there are reduced financial transfers to the states. For example, if we compare from 2015-16 to 2023-2024, there is a reduction in the gross tax revenues which are shared with the states from 35% to 30% right now in terms of the gross tax revenues. Now, the growth of the union and state government's tax revenues has been different. For example, for the union government, the tax revenues have grown by 2.3 times since 2015-16. For the state governments, they have grown by only 2 times. When we look at the grants in aid, there has been a constant decrease in the grants in aid to the states, and there is an increase in the share of the non-devolvable cess and surcharge. These cesses and surcharges are usually imposed by the central government on top of the taxes. The taxes have to be devolved, the tax revenues have to be devolved, shared with the states on recommendation of Finance Commission, but the cesses and surcharges the central government usually keeps for itself. In 2015-16, the cesses and surcharges accounted for only 6% of the union government tax revenues. Now it has grown to 10%. That is, this money the central government keeps for itself. The public expenditure also has been centralized. For example, out of the 20 lakh crore rupees that was supposed to be given as part of the central sector schemes and the centrally sponsored schemes, only 4.25 lakh crore rupees has been devolved, and that also is tied grants. So it is curtailing of the state's autonomy in terms of the usage of those grants. Plus there is the erosion of state taxation autonomy as there is the implementation of GST. After this, for example, earlier the states could impose the value added tax which used to be a state's tax revenue, but now it has been subsumed under GST itself. Plus there are issues with GST also. For example, there are complaints by some states that there is the discontinuation of the GST compensation cess. That is, after the implementation of GST, there was a loss of revenue collection for some states. There it was compensated by the central government for a certain period. Now it has been discontinued. Now, why we should be worried about the fiscal centralization tendency? One, it violates the principle of fiscal federalism, which forms the core basis of federalism, and it leads to a burden on the state exchequer. That is, the state finances, there will be a strain on them because the states will be forced to borrow for taking up various developmental welfare activities or any capital expenditure also because of the lesser revenues, lesser money available with them. Plus, it might lead to interstate inequality that will be more and more, that will be exacerbated, because the less wealthy states, they will also have to match the contribution of the central contribution in the implementation of centrally sponsored schemes. For that again they will have to borrow funds. Plus, there is a potential bias in the resource allocation, as has been alleged by some states. For example, the southern states, they have lost more, and it leads to the fueling of regionalism and even separatist tendencies, because such regional feelings are prevalent. As the southern states, they have borne the brunt of such tendencies of fiscal centralization. Now, what are the suggestions for this to resolve this issue and to ensure that the principles of fiscal federalism are upheld? One, that the 16th Finance Commission, that should consider increasing the devolution of the share of the state governments among the net tax revenues. It can be increased from the current 41% of the net tax revenues which are shared by the union government with the states. It can be increased. Second, the principles of horizontal as well as vertical devolution of funds, they also need a relook. The public expenditure has to be rationalized, and the GST concerns will also have to be addressed. That is, there are concerns that the GST has favored the consuming states rather than the producing states. The consuming states like UP, Bihar, etc., they have benefited, whereas the producing states like Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, they have not benefited. Also, another suggestion can be empowering the third tier of the government, that is the Panchayati Raj institutions and urban local bodies. They should also be having their own specific powers of taxation. They should have their own revenue generation source, so that they are not entirely dependent upon the grants, upon the devolution of funds by the central government or the state governments. Now, the next article is related to fuel cells. The context behind it is that Prime Minister Modi flagged off India's first indigenously built hydrogen fuel cell ferry boat. This is important in the paper GS3 under Science and Technology. Also, it can be used in Indian economy as part of energy and the development of renewable energy. Now, what are fuel cells? Fuel cells are electrochemical devices that produce electricity through a chemical reaction. That chemical reaction happens between two electrodes, an anode and a cathode. The anode is usually the fuel electrode and cathode is usually the oxygen electrode. Now, there is no combustion happening, unlike any internal combustion engines like petrol engines or diesel engines. There is no recharging also which is done in a fuel cell, unlike the batteries, lithium ion batteries, etc. And it can potentially meet 7% of India's power needs by 2032 as per government sources. Now, first let's understand how does a fuel cell work. In a fuel cell, usually there are two electrodes, and hydrogen is the fuel which is usually fed continuously to the fuel electrode, which is anode. And at the anode there is a catalyst which is present. This catalyst helps in breaking down the hydrogen into protons and electrons. There is an electrolyte which is sandwiched between the two electrodes, between the fuel electrode and the oxygen electrode. Now, once the catalyst breaks down the hydrogen into protons and electrons, the electrolyte allows only the protons to pass through. it blocks the electrons. The electrons are sent through the external circuit which is having that electric current which we need. And at the cathode, the protons and the electrons which are coming through the electrical circuit, they meet along with oxygen and it helps in the production of water and a little heat and electricity. These are the byproducts from the fuel cell. Usually only a tiny amount of electricity is generated using a single fuel cell. So in practice, a large number of fuel cells, they are stacked together to generate enough electricity for practical usage. So what are the advantages of fuel cells? One advantage is it provides for clean and efficient energy. Unlike the internal combustion engines like petrol or diesel engines, there is very little emission of particulate matter or nitrogen oxides or sulfur oxides, etc. And plus it is highly efficient as compared to the internal combustion engines. Second, it is providing a reliable backup power. Reliable, therefore it can be used in hospitals, data centers, etc. And it can be used like a backup option also, because unlike the intermittency of other renewable energy options, for example the solar energy, the solar cell produces electricity only during the day, not during the night, whereas the fuel cells, they can produce electricity anytime and the fuel is fed to the anode continuously. It is having those energy storage capabilities also. Whenever there is extra production of energy, electricity which is not needed, it can also be stored. And not only hydrogen, there are different fuels which can be used in a fuel cell. It can be generated, the electricity can be generated using natural gas, biogas, methanol, ethanol, etc., provided that you are choosing the right electrolyte as well. Now, what are the challenges regarding it? One, it is having a high initial cost, because the components of a fuel cell, the electrolytes, the cathode, the anode, etc., they are in early stages of development. They are in early stages of commercialization, therefore they are costly. Plus, India is importing most of the components of the fuel cells. That drives up the cost. Once there is indigenous production which is set up and the scaling of production which comes into picture, then the economies of scale will kick in. Plus, it requires hydrogen infrastructure. The refueling of hydrogen, the production, storage and distribution of hydrogen, and the safety concerns which come along with it, because hydrogen is highly flammable in nature. There are technological limitations also, that the durability, the life cycle of the fuel cells, that has to be improved before they can be practically used. And the water which is released as a byproduct from the fuel cells, the hydrogen fuel cells, that also has to be managed, and the thermal efficiency also has to be improved. Now let's look at the various government steps to promote the fuel cells in India. One, the government came up with the National Hydrogen Energy Mission. This is to promote the cost competitive production of green hydrogen in India, that is the hydrogen which is produced using renewable energy sources. We call it the green hydrogen. And there is a National Hydrogen Energy Roadmap. This is to scale up the hydrogen production in India for practical commercial usage. The government provides for viability gap funding also. Viability gap funding in the form of 500 crore rupees has been provided by the government to set up hydrogen hubs. For the procurement of hydrogen fuel cell driven buses, there are subsidies which are given under the FAME India scheme. The fuel cell electric vehicles, they are getting incentives under the FAME India scheme. And to promote the R&D facilities, the research in the hydrogen fuel cells, there is the establishment of the National Hydrogen Energy Board, and the government has also established some centers of excellence. The government provides subsidies and tax exemptions, so that unless the indigenous production and research kicks up, till then there are liberalized green hydrogen and ammonia imports also which are allowed. That is, there are not huge custom duties or taxes which are imposed upon the imports. Now, the next article is related to WTO Investment Deal, the investment facilitation for development. India recently blocked an attempt by some WTO members who were led by China to ensure that the investment facilitation for development is a part of the development agenda of the 13th Ministerial Conference of WTO. This is important in GS2 under the topic important international institutions, their mandate, etc., because it is related to WTO, and in GS3 under the topic Indian economy and issues related to planning, mobilization of resources and growth, development, etc. Now, what is this investment deal? What is the investment facilitation agreement? This will be having legally binding provisions to facilitate the flow of investment. That is, the developed countries, the various countries having funds, they will be able to channelize investments in those countries which will not be having enough funds. That is, to essentially get more returns, and the states will be required to augment the measures related to transparency and to ensure predictability of the investment measures, etc. This initially started like an informal dialogue in 2017 as part of the dialogue by some least developed countries and some developing countries also who were seeking investment. Then officially the negotiations started in 2020 for the investment facilitation agreement. Now we call it the investment facilitation for development. Now India opposes this. Why? One, India says that this is beyond WTO's mandate, this is beyond the scope of WTO. Because investment matters are not related to trade and that should be kept out of the purview of the WTO. Negotiation should not be held under the purview of WTO. And India has concerns regarding the strategy of the West, the strategy of the developed nations. Today they are asking to sign an investment facilitation agreement. Tomorrow they might be asking for the protection rules, some protection rules for their own investment, then India will be on the back foot. Plus India says that such plurilateral agreements should not be a part of the WTO because plurilateral agreements as per India, there the decision making does not happen with consensus, and when the decision making is not with consensus, then the developing countries like India, they are put on the back foot. Plus India is wary of the most favored nation, the MFN provisions also, because in the past we have had bitter experiences with it and we had to face the negative repercussions also, for example in the case of the bilateral investment treaty with Australia. Therefore India took away all the initial bilateral investment treaties and came up with the 2016 model draft for the bilateral investment treaties and has been in the process of renegotiation of the BITs with various countries also. Plus India says that the legally binding dispute settlement will not be a part of it, because if the concerns are under the interstate dispute settlement mechanisms, then the investors who are coming from the developed countries, they might be able to sue the various developing countries where the investment is taking place as part of bringing it within the ambit of various bilateral investment treaties. India is wary of that. Plus India does not want any umbrella clauses in these, because such umbrella clauses were there in the initial bilateral investment treaties also. Now the newly negotiated BITs with various countries, India is wary of such umbrella clauses where the investors can sue the states, the countries where they are having investments. Thank you.